Get out of my house, Patty. You don't deserve this place anyway. Tiffany's shrill voice echoed through our living room as she hurled my wedding photo across the hardwood floor. The frame shattered instantly. A sliver of glass skidded toward me, slicing my bare foot, but I barely noticed the pain. My heart was pounding too hard in my chest, drowning out everything except the blood rushing in my ears. My husband Michael stood between us, silent as a statue, his jaw clenched and hands trembling at his sides. 13 years of marriage, and in this moment, our anniversary of all days, he couldn't find his voice. His mother, Nancy, perched on my sofa like she owned it, sipping tea from the delicate china set that once belonged to my mother, my dead mother, the only inheritance I'd ever received. "This isn't what we discussed, Tiffany," Michael finally muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. It always did when confronting his family. I stared at the broken frame on the floor. Our wedding day, the same day we had stood under the old oak tree in his parents' backyard and vowed to build a life together. I remembered the way the sunlight had filtered through the leaves, casting dappled shadows across Michael's face as he promised to cherish me forever. Now, 13 years later, his family, the same people who had inherited over $300,000 from Michael's late Aunt Lillian just 6 months ago, had not only squandered every penny on a luxury cruise through the Mediterranean, but they had returned with designer luggage and empty bank accounts, demanding to live in my house. And when I said no, I was called selfish, disrespectful, ungrateful. "We're family," Nancy said, placing her teacup down with practiced elegance. "And family takes care of each other, don't they, Michael?" Michael looked at me, then at his mother, trapped in that familiar no-man's land of indecision. I saw the conflict in his eyes, the same conflict I'd seen 1,000 times before. But this was different. This was our home, the home we'd scrimped and saved for, the one I'd worked 2 jobs to help afford. "It's just temporary," he offered weakly. I felt something inside me crack. Not break, not yet, but fracture dangerously. "I've already enrolled Jasmine in the local high school," Tiffany announced, referring to her 16-year-old daughter who was thankfully absent from this confrontation. "She'll take the spare bedroom." "There is no spare bedroom," I replied, finding my voice at last. "That's my office, where I grade papers and prepare lessons for 32 children who depend on me." Tiffany rolled her eyes. "It's just a bunch of books and a desk. You can work at the kitchen table." "And I'll take the master," Nancy added casually. "My back can't handle that guest." "Bed?" "Michael mentioned your mattress is memory foam." I turned to Michael, disbelief etched across my face. "You discussed giving them our bedroom?" He wouldn't meet my eyes. "Mom has her sciatica, Patty. We could use the guest room for a while." The room seemed to tilt beneath my feet. This wasn't happening. Not on our anniversary. Not after everything we'd built together. "No," I said firmly, surprised by the steadiness in my voice. "This is my home too, and I didn't agree to this." Nancy's face darkened. She placed her teacup down with enough force to chip the rim. My mother's cup, damaged now like everything else they touched. "This house only exists because of our family," she hissed. "Michael's the man of the house. If he says we live here, we live here. That's not how marriage works," I countered, feeling heat rise to my cheeks. "And that's certainly not how property ownership works." "Oh, look at Teacher Patty, giving us a lesson," Tiffany sneered. "Always thinking you're smarter than everyone. So high and mighty with your classroom full of brats." "Don't talk about my students that way," I said, my voice dropping dangerously low. "Or what?" Tiffany stepped closer, the scent of expensive perfume, undoubtedly purchased with Aunt Lillian's money, making me nauseated. "What exactly will you do, Patty?" The front door opened before I could respond. Our elderly neighbor, Mrs. Deacon, stood in the doorway, a folded document clutched in her thin hand. At 72, she moved with surprising purpose, her gray eyes sharp as she surveyed the scene. "I wasn't going to get involved," she said, her voice steady as she closed the door behind her. "But I think Patty deserves to see this." Nancy stood quickly, nearly knocking over the tea tray. "Evelyn, this is a private family matter." "Is it?" Mrs. Deacon raised an eyebrow. "Because I could hear you shouting from across the street, and what I heard sounded like bullying, not family." She walked toward me, ignoring Nancy's sputtering objections. The document in her hand seemed ordinary, just a folded piece of paper, but the look in her eyes told me it was anything but. "Lillian gave this to me before she passed," Mrs. Deacon said quietly. She made me promise to keep it safe, said there might come a day when you'd need it. I took the paper with trembling fingers, aware that the room had fallen completely silent. As I unfolded it, Michael stepped closer, peering over my shoulder. What Mrs. Deacon revealed in that moment didn't just change the course of the argument, it shattered the lies that Nancy and Tiffany had built for years. It exposed everything, and it finally set me free. I never married Michael for his money. He didn't have any. We were both teachers when we met at Rosefield Elementary, 13 years ago. Humble incomes, modest dreams. He taught 5th grade science while I handled 3rd grade, and we bonded over shared lunches in the teacher's lounge. Michael had a crooked smile that made me laugh even during standardized testing season, and eyes that crinkled at the corners when he explained how photosynthesis worked to distracted 10-year-olds. For 13 years, I worked 2 jobs, teaching by day, waitressing on weekends at Milo's Diner, while Michael slowly built a side career in real estate. We saved every penny to buy our home in Rosefield, a charming 2-story craftsman that needed love but had good bones, as the realtor had emphasized. I remember the day we signed the mortgage papers. Michael had squeezed my hand under the table, a silent acknowledgement of what we'd accomplished together. Later that night, we'd sat on the bare floor of our empty living room, eating takeout Chinese food by candlelight, planning where every piece of furniture would go. "We did it, Patty," he'd whispered against my hair. "Our own place. No one can take this from us." Oh, the bitter irony of those words now. Meanwhile, his family lived well beyond their means. Nancy, his mother, carried herself like a socialite despite living off credit cards and a modest pension from her late husband's postal service career. She colored her hair the same shade of blonde as her Gucci purse, both fake, though she'd never admit it. At family dinners, she'd regale everyone with stories of her youth, each tale more grandiose than the last, as if she'd been American royalty rather than the daughter of a plumber from Toledo. Tiffany, Michael's brother's widow, never worked a day but always wore designer clothes and spoke like she belonged in Manhattan, rather than our Midwest suburb. After David died from a heart attack 5 years ago, she'd latched onto Nancy, and together they formed an impenetrable alliance of entitlement. I stayed polite, helpful, always biting my tongue when Nancy would inspect my housekeeping or when Tiffany would comment on my sensible clothing choices. Michael would squeeze my hand under the table, our private signal that meant, "Thank you for your patience." But patience has its limits. When Michael's Aunt Lillian passed 6 months ago, she left a sizable inheritance, $315,000 to be exact. I remember Nancy's smirk at the reading of the will, the way she'd leaned over to Tiffany and whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear, "Lillian would have wanted us to live well." I didn't ask for a dime. Michael and I had built our life cent by cent, and though things were tight sometimes, we managed. But what Nancy and Tiffany did next shocked even me. Within weeks, Tiffany had posted photos of them on a private yacht in Greece. Nancy had booked spa resorts in Italy, chartered helicopters over the Alps, and even bought a custom diamond bracelet, all while Michael and I were still budgeting for groceries and putting off replacing our 15-year-old water heater. They didn't even mention the inheritance to us. I found out on Instagram, scrolling through my feed during lunch duty at school, nearly choking on my sandwich when I saw Nancy, lounging on a Mediterranean beach with the caption, "Living Aunt Lillian's best life for her. Blessed, cheer inheritance perks." At first, I said nothing. Michael seemed unbothered by the extravagance, or perhaps he was just conditioned to accept his family's behavior without question. And it wasn't our money, after all. Aunt Lillian had named Nancy as the sole beneficiary. Who were we to judge how she spent it? Until they returned 3 months later with empty bank accounts and showed up on our doorstep with 6 suitcases and a demand rather than a request. "We're staying here," Tiffany had announced, rolling her Louis Vuitton luggage across our threshold without waiting for an invitation. Nancy followed with her matching set, already instructing Michael where to place them. Michael stood. Behind them, silent and shamefaced. He hadn't known what they were planning either. They had sold Nancy's condo to cover trip debts and credit card bills. Now they were effectively homeless, having burned through a lifetime's savings in a single summer. But I had never agreed to house anyone. Our craftsman was modest. 3 bedrooms, one of which served as my home office. The other was our guest room, occasionally used when Michael's cousin visited from Chicago. Our lives were organized, peaceful. The thought of Nancy and Tiffany invading that peace made my stomach churn. "I'm sorry," I'd said calmly that first day, "but this is my home too, and I didn't agree to this." That's when the mask slipped. Nancy stood up, her face contorted with indignation. This house only exists because of our family. Michael's the man of the house. If he says we live here, we live here. Michael looked torn, caught between loyalty to his mother and respect for our marriage. He tried to mediate, saying it was temporary, just until they got back on their feet. But then I found the receipts. Tiffany had used part of the inheritance to pay off her private debts, including credit card bills under Michael's name. She had forged his signature and tied his name to multiple loans. My husband was now in legal debt for money he never saw. When I confronted them with the evidence, statements I'd found in Tiffany's carelessly open purse, she laughed. Actually laughed in my face. He's family, she'd said with a dismissive wave. What's his is mine. And what's mine? Well, it's expensive. That's when I knew this wasn't just about needing a place to stay. This was a calculated takeover, years in the making. They had always seen Michael as their safety net, their backup plan. And by extension, they saw our home, the home we'd sacrificed for, as rightfully theirs whenever they needed it. 13 years of biting my tongue had led to this moment. 13 years of peacekeeping had emboldened them. 13 years of silence had made them think I would never speak up. They were wrong. I asked them to leave. Those 5 words, so simple, so reasonable, ignited a firestorm that would consume the next 2 weeks of my life. Nancy's face flushed crimson, her carefully manicured hand flying to her throat in theatrical shock. Tiffany's reaction was more direct. She slammed her palm against our kitchen table so hard my coffee mug jumped and spilled across the surface, staining the placemat Michael's students had made for him last Teacher Appreciation Day. If you don't let us stay, I'll ruin you, Tiffany hissed, leaning in close enough that I could see the individual clumps of mascara on her lashes. I'll make sure the whole town knows what kind of user you are, Patty. User? I echoed, genuinely confused. I've worked for everything I have. Nancy let out a cold laugh. Oh, please. We all know you married Michael because he was the only man desperate enough to have you. A plain, bookish nobody with no family connections. You saw a meal ticket and grabbed it. The words stung more than I cared to admit. Not because they were true, they weren't, but because they revealed how Nancy had always seen me, as an opportunist rather than someone who truly loved her son. Michael finally spoke up, his voice uncharacteristically firm. That's enough, Mom. Patty's my wife. You can't talk to her like that in our home. Our home. The words hung in the air between us, a momentary alliance that gave me hope, but Nancy knew exactly how to dismantle it. Your home? She asked, her voice suddenly soft, wounded. After everything I sacrificed for you? I went without so you could have. I worked 2 jobs after your father left. I gave you everything, Michael. Everything. Her eyes welled with tears that seemed to appear on command. And now, when I need you for once, just once, you're choosing her. I watched my husband's resolve crumble like a sandcastle at high tide. His shoulders slumped, his gaze dropped to the floor. We can figure something out, he mumbled, just for a little while. That night, I slept in the guest room, my own form of protest. Michael tried to follow, but I locked the door. I needed space to think, to plan my next move. Through the thin walls, I could hear Nancy and Tiffany in the living room, their voices low but triumphant. They were discussing which of my things they'd store to make room for theirs. The next morning, I called in sick to school, something I rarely did, even when genuinely ill. I waited until Michael left for work, then confronted Nancy and Tiffany directly. You have 3 days to find alternative arrangements, I said, my teacher voice in full effect, the one I used when setting non-negotiable classroom boundaries. Tiffany smirked, exchanging a look with Nancy. Or what, exactly? Or I'll contact the credit card companies about the fraudulent accounts in Michael's name, I replied evenly. Identity theft is a felony, Tiffany. The smirk vanished. You wouldn't dare. Try me. I left for school then, feeling a strange mix of empowerment and dread. I'd never been confrontational, had spent my life avoiding conflict, in fact, but something had shifted inside me. A lifetime of accommodating others at my own expense had finally reached its breaking point, but I had underestimated my opponents. When I returned home that afternoon, a police officer was waiting in my driveway. He introduced himself as Officer Mendez and explained that he was responding to a domestic disturbance call. There must be some mistake, I said, confused. Everything's fine here. Are you Patricia Warren? He asked, consulting his notepad. Yes, that's me. I have a report from a Tiffany Warren claiming you made violent threats against her and her mother-in-law this morning. My blood ran cold. That's absolutely not true. I asked them to leave my home, a home they have no legal right to occupy, and mentioned that I knew about some financial fraud they'd committed. There were no threats. Officer Mendez looked sympathetic but professional. Ma'am, I understand this is upsetting, but I need to inform you that Ms. Warren has filed for an emergency restraining order against you. The judge granted it temporarily until the hearing next week. He handed me a document, and the world seemed to tilt beneath my feet as I read it. According to the paperwork, I was barred from coming within 100 feet of Tiffany Warren, which effectively meant I couldn't enter my own home since she was currently residing there. This is insane, I whispered. They're trying to force me out of my own house. I can only enforce the order, ma'am, Officer Mendez said gently. You'll have your chance to present your side at the hearing. In the meantime, do you have somewhere you can stay? Somewhere I could stay? This was my home. The home I'd painted every wall of. The home where I'd nursed Michael through pneumonia 2 winters ago. The home where I graded papers at the kitchen table while snow fell quietly outside. And now I was being exiled from it based on a lie. Can I at least get some of my things? I asked, my voice breaking despite my best efforts. Officer Mendez nodded and escorted me inside. Tiffany stood in the living room, arms crossed, a victorious smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Nancy sat primly on the sofa, my sofa, pretending to be engrossed in a magazine. You have 15 minutes, the officer said. I moved through my home like a ghost, grabbing essentials, clothes, toiletries, my laptop, and the lesson plans I'd need for the next week. In the bedroom, I found Michael's side of the closet completely emptied, his belongings already relocated to the guest room. He hadn't even warned me, hadn't called to say, by the way, my sister-in-law has legally banned you from our home with false accusations. That was the moment I realized. This wasn't just about money or living arrangements. This was war. I spent that night at my friend Lisa's apartment, crying until my eyes swelled and my throat felt raw. Lisa, a fellow teacher who taught music at our school, listened as I poured out the whole sordid story. When I finished, she didn't offer empty platitudes or useless advice. Instead, she said, "You need a lawyer. Now." The next morning, I called in sick again and met with Eleanor Reeves, a family law attorney Lisa had recommended. Eleanor listened carefully, taking detailed notes, her expression growing increasingly grim. "They're trying to gaslight you out of your own property," she said when I finished. "It's not uncommon in family disputes, but this is particularly egregious. The good news is the restraining order won't hold up in court if there's no evidence of threats or violence." "And the bad news?" I asked. Eleanor sighed. "The bad news is that undoing this will take time. The hearing isn't for another week, and in the meantime, they're establishing occupancy in your home, which complicates things. Can we counterfile something? Get me back into my house?" "We can, and we will," she nodded. "But I want to be strategic about this. If they've forged Michael's signature on credit accounts, that's a serious crime. We need to gather evidence before confronting them directly." That afternoon, I received a text from Michael, the first contact since I'd been effectively evicted from our home. "Patty, we need to talk. Mom says you threatened Tiffany? What's going on?" I stared at the message for a long time, anger and hurt warring within. Me. He was questioning me? After 13 years of marriage, he was asking if I had threatened someone? I typed a response, deleted it, then typed again. I never threatened anyone. I told Tiffany to leave our home and mentioned I knew about the fraudulent accounts she opened in your name. She's lying to force me out. Check our credit report if you don't believe me. His reply came hours later. "I know you're upset, but can we just calm down and work this out? Mom says she'll drop everything if you apologize." Apologize? For what? For expecting to live in my own home? For objecting to identity theft? I didn't respond. Instead, I forwarded the text to Eleanor, who advised me to minimize direct communication with Michael until we had our legal strategy in place. The next day, a large envelope arrived at Lisa's apartment addressed to me. Inside was a formal notice from our mortgage company, stating that they had received a request to remove my name from the home loan, a request supposedly initiated by me. Another forgery. Another attempt to erase me. That was when I understood the full scope of what I was facing. Nancy and Tiffany weren't just looking for temporary housing. They were systematically trying to remove me from my own life, from my marriage, my home, my financial security, everything I had built over 13 years. Document everything, Eleanor advised when I called her in a panic. Every text, every document, every interaction. We're going to need it all. So I did. I started a detailed journal, noting every development, every conversation. I pulled our credit reports, highlighting the suspicious accounts opened in Michael's name. I gathered mortgage statements, tax returns, and wedding photos, physical proof of the life they were trying to dismantle. By the end of the week, I had compiled a comprehensive file of evidence, but I still felt powerless, exiled from my own existence, until Mrs. Deacon knocked on Lisa's door. "I've been watching everything," Mrs. Deacon said as Lisa ushered her into the small apartment, "and I think it's time I shared what I know." Evelyn Deacon had lived next door to us for the entire 13 years of our marriage. A retired librarian with keen eyes and an even keener mind, she'd always been friendly but respectful of boundaries, the ideal neighbor. She rarely interfered in others' business, which made her presence in Lisa's apartment all the more significant. "Lillian and I were close friends," she explained, settling onto Lisa's sofa with the careful movements of someone mindful of aging joints. "We played bridge together every Thursday for 20 years. I sat across from her, a mug of untouched tea cooling between my hands. Michael's aunt? I didn't realize you knew her well." "Oh, yes," Mrs. Deacon nodded. "Lillian was quite fond of you, you know. She always said you were the best thing that ever happened to Michael." The words brought unexpected tears to my eyes. I'd only met Aunt Lillian a handful of times at family gatherings, where we'd exchanged pleasantries but never had deep conversations. To hear that she'd thought of me warmly felt like a small blessing in the midst of chaos. "About 6 months before she passed," Mrs. Deacon continued, "Lillian asked me to keep something for her. She reached into her purse and withdrew a sealed envelope, yellowed slightly with age. She said Nancy had been pressuring her about the inheritance, coming by almost daily, bringing gifts and making grand promises about how well she'd manage the money." Mrs. Deacon handed me the envelope. My name was written across the front in shaky handwriting. Lillian didn't trust Nancy. Never had. Said she'd watched her manipulate Michael his whole life and didn't want to enable it anymore. So she changed her will. My heart began to race. Changed her will? Yes. The document you saw at the official reading wasn't her final will. She wrote a new one leaving half the inheritance directly to you and Michael. But somehow, that version never made it to the lawyer. Mrs. Deacon's expression darkened. Lillian suspected Nancy might intercept it. That's why she gave me this copy, and asked me to give it to you if I ever saw Nancy taking advantage. With trembling fingers, I opened the envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter addressed to me, along with a photocopy of a legal document. A will, dated. Just 2 weeks before Lillian's death. "Dear Patricia, we haven't spoken much, but I've watched you love my nephew with patience and kindness for years. You work hard. You're honest. These are qualities my sister never valued, but I do. I'm leaving half my estate to you and Michael jointly. The money is for the only 2 people in the family who still believe in hard work and decency. That's you and Michael. Nancy will fight this. She always does. But remember, if she or Tiffany mishandle the money or attempt to exclude you from what is rightfully yours, they forfeit all rights to any property or financial support from you or Michael. I've made this explicitly clear in the updated will. Stand your ground, dear. You're stronger than you know. With affection, Lillian Warren." The photocopy of the will confirmed everything the letter stated, including the specific clause about forfeiture if Nancy or Tiffany misused the funds or attempted to manipulate access to them. "This is incredible," I whispered, looking up at Mrs. Deacon. "But if the updated will never made it to the lawyer, it's still legally binding," Mrs. Deacon said with certainty. "Lillian had it properly witnessed and notarized. I was one of the witnesses, along with her home health aide. The original may have disappeared, but this copy has legal weight, especially with witness testimony to back it up." For the first time in days, I felt a flicker of hope. "Mrs. Deacon, would you be willing to speak with my lawyer and possibly testify at the restraining order hearing?" "That's precisely why I'm here," she replied with a determined nod. "Lillian was my friend. I won't let her final wishes be corrupted by Nancy's greed." I called Eleanor immediately. She arrived at Lisa's apartment within the hour, reviewing the documents with growing excitement. "This changes everything," she said. already typing notes into her laptop. Not only does this undermine their financial claims, but it establishes a clear pattern of deception. The restraining order won't just be dismissed. We can countersue for fraud, harassment, and illegal eviction. The next few days passed in a blur of legal preparations. Eleanor filed motions, scheduled depositions, and built a case that grew stronger by the hour. Mrs. Deacon provided a detailed affidavit about Lillian's true intentions, and the home health aide was located, and agreed to corroborate the existence of the updated will. Meanwhile, I hadn't heard from Michael in days. His silence spoke volumes. He was either fully complicit in his family's schemes or too weak to stand against them. Either way, the husband I thought I knew seemed to be vanishing before my eyes. The morning of the restraining order hearing arrived crisp and clear. I dressed carefully in a modest navy dress, the same one I wore to parent-teacher conferences, and entered the courthouse with Eleanor and Mrs. Deacon flanking me like guardians. In the hallway outside the courtroom, I spotted them, Nancy, Tiffany, and Michael, huddled together in conversation with a slick-looking attorney in an expensive suit. Michael saw me first, his eyes widening in what might have been shame or surprise. He started to step toward me, but Nancy grabbed his arm, her fingers digging visibly into his sleeve. "Remember what we discussed," I heard her hiss. The bailiff called our case and we filed into the courtroom. As we took our seats, I caught a glimpse of Tiffany's confident smirk, the expression of someone who believed victory was assured. She had no idea what was coming. Judge Martinez, a stern-faced woman with silver-streaked hair, reviewed the case file briefly before addressing the court. "This is a hearing regarding an emergency restraining order filed by Tiffany Warren against Patricia Warren. Ms. Warren, you claim the respondent made violent threats against you in your residence. Is that correct?" Tiffany stepped forward, the picture of wounded innocence in a conservative, beige suit. "Yes, Your Honor. She threatened to, and I quote, make me regret ever stepping foot in her house." She was shaking with rage. I feared for my safety and that of my mother-in-law. I bit my tongue, fighting the urge to object to her blatant lies. "And this occurred in your residence?" Judge Martinez clarified. "Yes, Your Honor. I've been living there since returning from Europe." Eleanor stood. "Your Honor, if I may address the court regarding the residence in question?" Judge Martinez nodded, and Eleanor approached the bench, presenting the mortgage documents, tax records, and property deed that clearly showed the house belonged jointly to Michael and me. "Your Honor, the petitioner has no legal claim to the residence. In fact, she has been illegally occupying my client's home and used this fraudulent restraining order as a means to force my client from her own property." Tiffany's attorney jumped to his feet. "Objection. The ownership of the property is irrelevant to the restraining order. The issue is the alleged threats." "The ownership is entirely relevant," Eleanor countered smoothly, "as it speaks to motive. The petitioner has orchestrated this entire situation to gain control of assets that don't belong to her." Judge Martinez considered this. "I'm inclined to agree that context matters here. Please continue, Counselor." Eleanor then introduced Mrs. Deacon as a witness. As the elderly woman was sworn in, I watched Nancy's face drain of color. She leaned over to whisper urgently to her attorney, who looked increasingly concerned. With quiet dignity, Mrs. Deacon testified about Lillian's true will, the inheritance that should have been split between Michael and me, and how she had witnessed Nancy and Tiffany systematically working to exclude me from what was rightfully mine. "And were you present during the alleged threatening incident?" Eleanor asked. "I was in my garden, which shares a fence with the Warrens' kitchen window," Mrs. Deacon replied. "I heard the entire conversation clearly. Patricia never made any threats. She simply asked them to leave her home and mentioned that she was aware of financial fraud that had been committed against her husband." Tiffany's carefully constructed facade began to crumble. She shot a panicked look at Nancy, who was furiously scribbling notes to her attorney. Then Eleanor delivered the final blow. She presented bank records showing the fraudulent accounts opened in Michael's name, along with credit card statements revealing Tiffany and Nancy's extravagant European spending, all dated after Lillian's death and the distribution of the inheritance. The courtroom fell silent as Judge Martinez reviewed the evidence. I dared to glance at Michael, who sat ashen-faced, staring at the documents as if seeing them for the first time. Perhaps he was. Finally, Judge Martinez looked up, her expression stern. "Based on the evidence presented, I am dismissing the restraining order effective immediately. Furthermore," she continued as Tiffany began to protest, I am referring this matter to the District Attorney's Office for investigation into potential charges of fraud, identity, theft, and filing false reports. She turned her gaze directly to Tiffany. Ms. Warren, I strongly suggest you vacate the petitioner's residence today. If you do not, the court will authorize law enforcement to remove you. As we exited the courtroom, I felt a strange lightness. Not happiness exactly, but the weightlessness that comes from having truth finally acknowledged. Nancy and Tiffany hurried past without looking at me, their attorney trailing behind with a resigned expression. Only Michael lingered, his eyes meeting mine across the courthouse hallway. Patty, he began, taking a hesitant step toward me. I didn't know about any of it. The accounts? Mom intercepting the will? I swear. I looked at my husband of 13 years, the man who had stood silent while I was forced. From our home, who had failed to question the obvious lies, who had chosen comfort over truth. I believe you, I said quietly. And that's the problem. When I returned home that afternoon, escorted by Officer Mendez, the same officer who had removed me days earlier, I found the house in disarray. Nancy and Tiffany had left in a hurry, taking what they could carry and leaving chaos in their wake. Drawers hung open, closets had been ransacked, and in the kitchen, my mother's china lay in pieces across the tile floor, clearly smashed in a final act of spite. I stood among the wreckage, fighting back tears. These weren't just things. They were pieces of my life, my history. The china had been my mother's wedding gift, passed down when she died shortly after Michael and I married. Now it was reduced to sharp, gleaming shards, beyond repair, much like my marriage. Do you want to file a report for the damage? Officer Mendez asked gently. I shook my head. No, I just want to put my home back together. He nodded, understanding in his eyes. For what it's worth, Mrs. Warren, I'm sorry about all this. Sometimes family can be... He trailed off, searching for the right word. Complicated? I offered. I was going to say toxic, he replied with a sad smile. Call us if you need anything else. After he left, I began the slow process of reclaiming my space. I swept up the broken china, carefully setting aside the few intact pieces. I returned displaced items to their proper homes, straightened picture frames, and opened windows to dispel the lingering scent of Nancy's cloying perfume. With each small act of restoration, I felt myself growing stronger, more resolved. As evening fell, I heard the front door open. Michael stood in the entryway, uncertainty etched across his face. He carried a single duffel bag, all he'd taken when moving to the guest room a week ago. Can I come in? He asked as if he were a visitor in his own home. I nodded, continuing to fold the laundry I'd found scattered across our bedroom floor. Where are they staying? I asked, my voice carefully neutral. With Cousin Deborah across town, he replied, setting his bag down cautiously. Mom's furious. Tiffany's threatening to appeal the judge's decision. Let her try. Michael moved closer, his hands fidgeting at his sides. Patty, I know I messed up. I should have stood up to them. I should have seen what they were doing. Yes, I agreed simply. You should have. I didn't know about the credit cards, I swear, or about Aunt Lillian's real will. When I saw those documents in court today, he shook his head, disbelief still fresh. How could they do that? The better question, I said, finally meeting his eyes, is why you believed them over me. He flinched as if I'd struck him. I didn't. You did, I interrupted. When Tiffany accused me of threatening her, you asked if it was true. After 13 years of marriage, you questioned whether I was capable of violence. I was confused. They kept saying you were overreacting, that you just needed time to adjust. To being homeless? I laughed, the sound brittle even to my own ears. To being erased from my own life? What exactly was I supposed to adjust to, Michael? He had no answer for that. Instead, he gestured vaguely at the laundry basket. Can I help? I handed him a stack of towels. We worked in silence for several minutes, the familiar domestic routine now underscored by an ocean of unspoken words. I've been thinking, Michael finally said, his voice low, about what the judge said regarding the inheritance. I tensed. Of course he wanted to talk about the money. What about it? If Aunt Lillian's real will is enforced, we're entitled to half of what Mom received. He folded a pillowcase with methodical precision. That's over $150,000. Money they've already spent, I reminded him. On Mediterranean cruises and diamond bracelets? Not all of it, Michael said, surprising me. My cousin Roger works at First National. He told me Mom opened a separate account when they got back from Europe. There's still about $80,000 left. I set down the shirt I was folding. How do you know this? I asked him to check, after court today. Michael looked ashamed. I know it's not right that he accessed her account information, but I needed to know the truth. For the first time since this ordeal began, I saw a glimmer of the man I had married, someone willing to pursue truth, even when it was uncomfortable. It wasn't enough to erase the hurt, but it was something. What are you suggesting? I asked. That we file for our rightful share. Eleanor said we have grounds for a civil suit, especially with Mrs. Deacon's testimony about the will. I considered this, trying to untangle my feelings. Part of me wanted justice, financial restitution for what Nancy and Tiffany had taken. But another part, a deeper part, recognized that money had never been what truly mattered to me. Is that what you want? I asked. To sue your mother? Michael's shoulders slumped. What I want is for my family to be normal, decent, but they're not, are they? His voice broke slightly. I've spent my whole life making excuses for them, pretending their behavior was acceptable, and look where it's gotten us. In that moment, I saw Michael with painful clarity, not just as my husband, but as a child who had been taught that love meant enduring mistreatment, that family loyalty required self-erasure. Nancy had trained him well, grooming him from childhood to prioritize her needs above his own, and I had married him thinking I could heal that wound. We don't have to decide tonight, I said, softening slightly. Let's just get through this first. Michael nodded, gratitude evident in his eyes. Can I stay? Here, I mean. In our room. The question hung between us, weighted with implications about forgiveness, trust, and the future of our marriage. The guest bed is still made up, I replied quietly. I think we both need space right now. He accepted this without argument, gathering his toothbrush and pajamas before heading down the hall. As the guest room door closed behind him, I sat on our bed, my bed now, and allowed myself to truly feel everything I'd been suppressing. The rage, the hurt, the bone-deep exhaustion of fighting for what should have been freely given. For 13 years, I had been the peacekeeper, the one who smoothed rough edges and built bridges. I had believed that patience and kindness would eventually be recognized and reciprocated. But Nancy and Tiffany had seen my compassion as weakness, my accommodation as an invitation to take more. Never again. The next morning, I woke early and drove to school, grateful for the routine of teaching. My third graders were blissfully unaware of the drama in my personal life, concerned only with multiplication tables and the class pet hamster's weekend adventures. Their innocence was a balm to my wounded spirit. During my lunch break, I received a text from Eleanor. Judge signed the emergency injunction. Nancy and Tiffany barred from contacting you or entering your property. Hearing for permanent. Order set for next Friday. Relief washed through me. At least I was legally protected now, regardless of what Michael decided about our marriage. When I returned home that afternoon, I found Michael in the kitchen, surrounded by grocery bags. I thought I'd make dinner, he explained hesitantly. Your favorite, chicken piccata. The gesture was small but meaningful, an acknowledgement of my preferences, my existence. For 13 years, dinner had been my responsibility, scheduled around Michael's real estate showings and his mother's impromptu visits. Thank you, I said, setting down my bag of student papers. That would be nice. As he cooked, Michael told me he'd spoken with Eleanor about our legal options regarding Lillian's inheritance. She thinks we have a solid case, especially with Mrs. Deacon's testimony. But she also mentioned something else, the identity theft charges against Tiffany. I leaned against the counter, watching him slice lemons with careful precision. What about them? If we press charges, she could face jail time. It's a felony, Patty. The knife paused mid-slice as he looked up at me, conflict evident in his eyes. She has Jasmine to think about. My niece. Ah, there it was. The familiar pull of family obligation, already tugging him back toward forgiveness without accountability. Jasmine is 16, I reminded him gently. Almost an adult. And what message does it send her if her mother faces no consequences for stealing your identity? Michael resumed cutting, his movements less certain. I know you're right. I keep thinking about how all this will affect her. Perhaps you should be thinking about how it affected us, I replied, my voice level but firm. How it's still affecting us. He set down the knife, turning to face me fully. I am. That's why I called Tiffany this morning. My body tensed involuntarily. You what? I told her she has two options. Either sign a legally binding agreement to repay what she stole, with interest, or face criminal charges. Eleanor helped me draft the terms. I stared at him, stunned by this unexpected backbone. And her response? She called me several creative names, Michael said with a grim smile, then hung up. But Roger texted an hour later saying she came to the bank asking about payment plans. For the first time in weeks, I felt the faintest flicker of pride in my husband. It wasn't enough to erase the damage, but it was a start. A small step toward the partnership I had always believed our marriage could be. As we ate dinner that night, sitting across from each other at our kitchen table, the silence between us felt different. Not comfortable exactly, but no longer crackling with unspoken accusations. We were two people surveying the wreckage of our shared life, tentatively considering whether anything might be salvaged. I've been thinking about what you said in the courthouse, Michael said as we cleared the dishes. I believe you, and that's the problem. I nodded, remembering the moment clearly. You meant that my ignorance wasn't an excuse, he continued, that I should have seen what was happening. Yes, I agreed. But it's more than that. You've spent your life believing their version of reality, Michael, even when the evidence contradicted it, even when it hurt people you claimed to love. He flinched but didn't deny it. How do I change that? How do I see clearly after all this time? The question was so earnest, so vulnerable, that I felt my carefully constructed walls begin to tremble. I don't know, I admitted. That's something you have to figure out for yourself. But I do know it starts with telling the truth. To yourself, most of all. Later that night, as I prepared for bed, I found a small box on my pillow. Inside was a delicate teacup, not from my mother's set, but similar in style. A handwritten note accompanied it. I know this doesn't replace what was broken. Nothing could. But I want you to know, I'm trying to see the damage clearly, all of it. M. I held the cup in my palm, feeling its fragile weight. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was acknowledgement, a first step toward whatever came next. 1 week after the court hearing, I was grading math quizzes in my classroom when my phone buzzed with a text from Eleanor. Turn on WKRN local news, Channel 5, now. I frowned, reaching for the remote that controlled the small TV mounted in the corner of my classroom, a relic from the days of educational programming. The screen flickered to life, and I nearly dropped my red pen. There was Tiffany, makeup perfectly applied, speaking directly to a reporter outside the county courthouse. The caption beneath her read, "Local woman claims fraud in family inheritance dispute," was supposed to be divided equally, she was saying, her voice carrying that familiar note of wounded innocence. But Nancy Warren took everything, spent it all on herself, and left nothing for her son or her granddaughter. We're just asking for justice. The reporter nodded sympathetically. And you've filed suit against your mother-in-law? Yes, Tiffany confirmed, dabbing at dry eyes with a tissue. For fraud and breach of fiduciary duty. It's not about the money, it's about what's right. I sat frozen, unable to believe what I was witnessing. Tiffany, who had helped Nancy spend the inheritance, who had committed identity theft against Michael, who had tried to force me from my own home, was now positioning herself as the victim seeking justice. My phone buzzed again. Don't worry, we're responding. Meet me at the courthouse at 3 p.m. When I arrived at the courthouse steps that afternoon, a small crowd had gathered. Local news vans lined the curb, cameras pointed toward a makeshift podium where Eleanor stood checking her notes. Michael waited nearby, looking uncomfortable in a suit and tie. What's happening? I whispered as I joined him. Damage control, Eleanor answered before Michael could speak. Tiffany's trying to control the narrative. We're not letting her. My stomach clenched. You want me to make a statement? Publicly? Eleanor's expression softened slightly. Not if you're uncomfortable, Patty, but this is your chance to set the record straight. Not just legally, but in the court of public opinion. I glanced at Michael, who seemed equally uncertain. The whole town will be watching, he murmured. They're already watching, Eleanor pointed out. Tiffany made sure of that. The question is whether they hear her version or the truth. She was right, of course. In a small community like Rosefield, news traveled fast and formed the foundation of reputations. If we remained silent, Tiffany's narrative would become the accepted reality, just as Nancy's manipulations had, shaped Michael's perceptions for decades. I'll do it, I decided, smoothing my skirt with suddenly clammy hands. What do I need to say? Eleanor smiled. Just the truth, Patty. That's all we need. As 3 o'clock approached, the crowd grew. I recognized several teachers from school, a few parents of my students, and, to my surprise, Mrs. Deacon, standing straight-backed despite her age, nodding encouragingly when our eyes met. Eleanor stepped to the microphone first, introducing herself as my attorney and outlining the basic facts of the case: Aunt Lillian's intercepted will, the inheritance that should have been shared, the fraudulent credit accounts, and the false restraining order. Mrs. Patricia Warren will now make a brief statement, she concluded, stepping aside. Heart-pounding, I approached the microphone. The faces before me blurred slightly, and for a moment, I feared my voice would fail. Then I caught sight of Mrs. Deacon's steady gaze, and something settled within me. My name is Patricia Warren, I began, my teacher's voice carrying clearly across the courthouse steps. For 13 years, I've been a third-grade teacher at Rosefield Elementary. Many of you know me, from parent-teacher conferences or school events. I paused, gathering my thoughts. What you may not know is that for those same 13 years, I've endured systematic emotional abuse from my mother-in-law and sister-in-law. I was told I wasn't good enough, smart enough, or worthy enough to be part of their family. I was excluded from decisions, ignored at gatherings, and treated as an outsider. In my own marriage, the crowd had grown utterly silent, hanging on every word. When Michael's Aunt Lillian passed away, she left instructions for her inheritance to be shared between us and Nancy Warren. Those instructions were intercepted and hidden. The entire inheritance, over $300,000, was spent on luxury cruises, designer clothes, and extravagant experiences while my husband and I continued, working multiple jobs to maintain our modest home. I looked directly into the nearest camera, knowing that Nancy and Tiffany would inevitably see this footage. When the money ran out, they came to our home demanding to live with us. When I refused, they filed a fraudulent restraining order against me, forcing me from my own house. They broke my family heirlooms, forged my husband's signature on credit accounts, and attempted to remove my name from our mortgage. My voice grew stronger with each word. I'm speaking publicly not because I want sympathy, but because I want truth. The inheritance was never mine to begin with, so this isn't about money. It's about decency. It's about acknowledging that family should build you up, not tear you down. It's about saying that emotional abuse is still abuse, even when it comes with a smile and the words, "We're family." From the corner of my eye, I saw Michael step forward, placing his hand on my shoulder in a gesture of solidarity that surprised me. Thank you for listening, I concluded. We won't be taking questions today. As I stepped back, the crowd erupted with questions anyway. Eleanor deftly moved to the microphone, stating that all further inquiries should be directed to her office. Michael guided me through the throng toward Eleanor's waiting car, his hand steady at the small of my back. Once inside the vehicle, I exhaled shakily. Did I say too much? You said exactly what needed to be said, Eleanor assured me, starting the engine. Clear, factual, and dignified. Perfect. Michael nodded agreement, though his "ewa" expression remained troubled. Mom's going to be livid. Your mother lost the right to an opinion when she stole from us, I replied, surprising myself with the firmness in my voice. This isn't about hurting her, Michael. It's about standing up for ourselves. The local news carried excerpts from my statement on the evening broadcast, juxtaposed with Tiffany's earlier claims. The contrast couldn't have been more stark, her rehearsed tears versus my calm recitation of facts. By morning, social media was buzzing with support, much of it from parents of my students and fellow teachers. But the true impact became clear 3 days later, when Eleanor called with news. Nancy's attorney reached out, she announced, her voice carrying a note of triumph. They want to settle. Settle what? Exactly? I asked, putting my phone on speaker so Michael could hear from across the kitchen table. Everything. The inheritance dispute, the identity theft charges, all of it. They're offering to return the remaining funds, approximately $76,000 according to the bank records we subpoenaed, plus a structured payment plan for the rest. Michael leaned forward. What's the catch? A non-disclosure. Agreement, Eleanor replied. They want public silence from both of you about the entire situation. I met Michael's eyes across the table. They want us to pretend none of this happened. Essentially, yes, Eleanor confirmed. Standard procedure in settlements like this. They're trying to contain the damage to their reputations. Michael's laugh held no humor. A bit late for that, isn't it? What do you think? I asked him directly. It's your mother and sister-in-law we're talking about. He was quiet for a long moment, absently tracing the wood grain of our kitchen table with his finger. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a certainty I hadn't heard in years. I think we decline the settlement, he said. Not because we want more money, but because I'm done with the secrets, the hiding, the pretending. He looked up, meeting my gaze. Their power has always come from silence, Patty, from everyone agreeing not to talk about what they do. Pride bloomed in my chest, tentative but real. This was the man I had married, thoughtful, principled, kind. He had been buried under years of manipulation, but he was still there. I agree, I told Eleanor. No settlement. No non-disclosure agreement. We'll see this through properly, in court, if necessary. You're sure? Eleanor asked. A trial would be public. Messy. Every detail would come out. Good, Michael and I said simultaneously. After ending the call, we sat in comfortable silence for several minutes. Then Michael reached across the table, his hand open, an invitation rather than a demand. Thank you, he said simply, for not giving up on me. I placed my hand in his, feeling the familiar calluses on his palm. I haven't decided yet, I admitted. About us, I mean. There's a lot to rebuild. He nodded, accepting this truth without protest. I know, but for the first time in my life, I'm seeing clearly, and I like the view. As spring melted into summer, our case progressed through the legal system. Tiffany was formally charged with identity theft, eventually accepting a plea deal that included probation, community service, and full restitution. Nancy faced no criminal charges but was ordered by the civil court to return what remained of the inheritance and to make monthly payments toward the rest. More meaningful than the financial resolution was the shift in our community. Teachers, neighbors, and friends who had witnessed Nancy and Tiffany's behavior for years but never commented now approached me with stories of their own encounters. The subtle put-downs, the backhanded compliments, the manipulations they had observed but never named. I should have said something years ago, Mrs. Halsey, a fellow teacher, confessed one afternoon. The way Nancy spoke to you at the school fundraiser last year, it was cruel, but I didn't want to interfere in family matters. None of us did, added Mr. Chen, whose daughter had been in my class 3 years earlier. That's how people like that operate. They count on everyone staying polite and looking the other way. These conversations were healing in unexpected ways, validating experiences I had doubted for years. Had I been too sensitive, too demanding, too unwilling to accommodate? The collective witness of my community confirmed what I had always known but often questioned. The treatment I had endured was neither normal nor acceptable. Michael and I began marriage counseling, unpacking 13 years of patterns and assumptions. Some sessions left us drained, others brought tentative hope. We were building something new from the ground up. Not just our relationship, but Michael's understanding of himself, separate from his mother's definitions. I feel like I'm meeting myself for the first time, he admitted one evening as we walked around the neighborhood. A new ritual that gave us space to talk. Like I've been wearing someone else's glasses all my life, and now I can finally see clearly. On the anniversary of our court victory, exactly 1 year after Mrs. Deacon had revealed Aunt Lillian's true will, Michael suggested we host a small gathering at our home. Not a celebration exactly, but an acknowledgement of how far we had come. Mrs. Deacon was the guest of honor, of course, along with Eleanor, Lisa, and a few close friends who had supported us through the ordeal. The house was filled with laughter, an honest conversation, no pretense, no walking on eggshells, no carefully maintained facades. As evening fell, Michael raised his glass in a toast. To truth, he said simply, and to the people brave enough to speak it. Later, as our guests were leaving, Mrs. Deacon pulled me aside, pressing something into my hand. It was a small velvet pouch. Lillian wanted you to have this, she said. I was waiting for the right moment. Inside was a delicate silver locket, oval-shaped and etched with tiny flowers. When I opened it, there was a small handwritten note. For Patricia, may you always know your own worth. L. Tears pricked my eyes as I fastened it around my neck. Thank you, I whispered to Mrs. Deacon, for everything. She patted my cheek gently. Lillian saw something special in you, dear. She told me once that Michael had married far above himself, though she meant it as a compliment to you both. As Mrs. Deacon departed, I touched the locket at my throat, feeling its weight. Light but significant. like the truth it represented. Some inheritances, I realized, couldn't be measured in dollars. Some were measured in courage, in wisdom, in the steadfast belief in one's own worth. Those were the ones that truly mattered. Fall arrived in Rosefield with a spectacular display of color. The maple tree in our front yard blazed crimson against a clear blue sky, and mornings carried that distinct crispness that made me crave apple cider and warm sweaters. It had been 16 months since the courthouse confrontation, 14 since Tiffany's plea deal, and 12 since we'd last heard directly from Nancy. Life had settled into a new rhythm. Michael and I continued our weekly counseling sessions with Dr. Bennett, an older gentleman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense approach that suited us perfectly. Sometimes we made progress, other times we circled familiar wounds, but we kept showing up, kept talking, kept trying, and that alone felt like victory. On a particularly golden Saturday morning, I was grading papers at the kitchen table when my phone lit up with a text. The name that appeared made my stomach clench. Jasmine. Tiffany's daughter, Michael's niece, had maintained a careful distance throughout the ordeal. At 16, she'd been old enough to understand what was happening, but powerless to affect it. Michael had reached out to her several times, offering support regardless of what was happening with her mother, but she'd responded only with brief, non-committal texts. I opened the message with trepidation. "Hi, Aunt Patty. I know it's been a while. Could we maybe talk? I'm at the coffee shop on Main if you're free." I stared at the screen, conflicted. Jasmine had never been unkind to me, but she'd been raised in Tiffany's shadow, exposed to years of subtle and not-so-subtle messaging about my place in the family hierarchy. What could she possibly want to discuss now? I showed the text to Michael, who was making pancakes at the stove. "You should go," he said immediately, concern and hope mingling in his expression. "She's reaching out. That's huge, Patty." "What if it's a setup?" I asked, voicing the worry that had immediately surfaced. "What if Tiffany put her up to this?" Michael considered this. "It's possible," he acknowledged. "But Jasmine's almost 18 now, old enough to make her own decisions." He flipped a pancake with practiced ease. "And I think she's been doing a lot of that lately." "What do you mean?" "Roger mentioned she's been applying to colleges on her own. Schools in California, New York, places far from here. Far from Tiffany." This surprised me. Tiffany had always insisted that Jasmine would attend the local community college while living at home. "Smart girl," I murmured. 20 minutes later, I pushed open the door to Rosefield Coffee Company, scanning the Saturday morning crowd for a familiar face. I spotted Jasmine in the far corner, hunched over a textbook, her dark hair pulled back in a messy bun. She looked older than I remembered, more self-possessed. She glanced up as I approached, a nervous smile flickering across her face. "You came," she said, sounding genuinely surprised. "Of course," I replied, sliding into the chair across from her. "Is everything okay?" Jasmine closed her textbook. "AP Calculus," I noted, and took a deep breath. "I wanted to apologize," she said, the words coming out in a rush. "For everything that happened. For not saying anything when Mom and Grandma were being awful to you." I blinked, taken aback by her directness. "Jasmine, you were a child. None of that was your responsibility." "I was 16, she countered. "Old enough to know right from wrong." She fidgeted with her coffee cup. "And I knew what they were doing was wrong. I always knew." There was such raw honesty in her voice that I felt my guard lowering. This wasn't a setup. This was a young woman wrestling with her own moral awakening. "The way they talked about you when you weren't around," she continued, her voice dropping lower. "The things they planned, I should have warned you." "What do you mean planned?" I asked, a chill running through me despite the coffee shop's warmth. Jasmine looked around nervously before leaning across the table. "The restraining order was planned before you even asked them to leave. Mom had the papers ready. She told me it was an insurance policy in case you caused problems." Her eyes filled with tears. "And the will, I heard Grandma talking about it on the phone once, about how she'd taken care of it, so Uncle Michael wouldn't get his hands on Lillian's money." My mind reeled. Even knowing what Nancy and Tiffany were capable of, the calculated nature of their actions still shocked me. "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked gently. Jasmine wiped at her eyes with the sleeve of her oversized sweater. "Because I'm trying to be better than them. I'm trying to break the pattern." She looked up, her gaze direct despite her tears. "And because I'm leaving." "Leaving?" She nodded. "I got early admission to UCLA, full scholarship." A flicker of pride crossed her face. I leave in January for spring semester. Jasmine, that's incredible, I exclaimed, genuinely thrilled for her. Does your mom know? Her expression clouded. Not yet. I'm telling her tonight. She twisted a paper napkin between her fingers. She won't. Take it well. She's been saying I need to stay home, help with the house payments now that she has to make restitution. The unfairness of this made my chest ache. Jasmine had been caught in the crossfire of adult failures, and Tiffany was still trying to make her daughter pay the price. You deserve this opportunity, I said firmly. Your mother's financial obligations are not your burden to carry. That's what Uncle Michael said too. I raised an eyebrow. You've talked to Michael about this? She nodded. He's been helping me with the applications. And, she hesitated, he set up a small account for me, just enough for books and supplies that the scholarship doesn't cover. A wave of affection for my husband washed over me. He'd always had a soft spot for Jasmine, and clearly, he'd been supporting her quietly all along. Would you... Jasmine hesitated again. Would you come with me? When I tell Mom tonight, Uncle Michael said he would, but I thought maybe if you were there too. The request caught me off guard. You want me there? You stood up to her, Jasmine said simply. You didn't let her win. I need some of that courage tonight. I reached across the table and squeezed her hand. You already have more courage than you know. But yes, I'll be there. That evening, Michael and I drove to Tiffany's rented duplex on the other side of town. The neighborhood was a stark downgrade from her previous home, a tangible consequence of her actions. Are you sure about this? Michael asked as we parked at the curb. You don't owe Tiffany anything, Patty. Not even this. I thought about Jasmine, about the cycle of manipulation and emotional control that had shaped 3 generations of Michael's family. I'm not doing it for Tiffany, I replied. I'm doing it for Jasmine. And maybe a little bit for us too. Tiffany's face when she opened the door and saw me standing beside Michael was a study in conflicting emotions. Shock, anger, fear, and finally a resigned sort of calculation. She'd lost weight since I'd last seen her, and her carefully maintained appearance had slipped. Her roots needed touching up, and her clothes, while still designer, showed signs of wear. What is this? She demanded, blocking the doorway. I asked them to come, Jasmine said, appearing behind her mother. I have something to tell you, and I wanted them here. Tiffany's eyes narrowed, but she stepped aside, allowing us to enter a living room crowded with furniture clearly meant for a larger space, relics of her former life. What followed was one of the most difficult conversations I'd ever witnessed. Jasmine, with remarkable poise, explained her college plans, her scholarship, and her intention to leave in January. With each word, Tiffany's expression hardened. Absolutely not, she said when Jasmine finished. You're needed here. I'm your mother, and I forbid it. Mom, I'm 18 next month, Jasmine replied, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. I don't need your permission. You ungrateful little... Tiffany's voice rose dangerously. After everything I've done for you? The sacrifices I've made? Like what? Jasmine challenged, a hint of her mother's fire in her eyes. Like spending Dad's life insurance on designer handbags? Like forging Uncle Michael's signature on credit cards? Those kinds of sacrifices? I flinched, surprised by Jasmine's directness. Michael shifted beside me, his hand finding mine. Tiffany's gaze swung to us, venom in her eyes. This is your doing, she spat, turning my own daughter against me. No, Mom, Jasmine said firmly. This is my decision, mine alone. If you walk out that door, don't bother coming back, Tiffany threatened, her voice cold. You won't be welcome here. The room fell silent. I held my breath, watching Jasmine's face as she absorbed her mother's ultimatum. Then slowly she nodded. If that's your choice, she said quietly. I'll pack my things tonight. Tiffany's composure cracked. You can't be serious. Where will you even go? She can stay with us, Michael said, speaking for the first time since we'd arrived. Until January. Tiffany laughed, the sound brittle and sharp. Oh, isn't this perfect? My own brother stealing my daughter. What's next, Patty? Going to adopt her too? I met Tiffany's gaze evenly. No one is stealing anyone, Tiffany. Jasmine is making her own choice, the same way you made yours. Get out, Tiffany hissed. All of you, get out of my house. I'll come back for my things tomorrow, Jasmine said, her voice remarkably calm given the circumstances. When you're at work. As we walked to the car, Jasmine's shoulders sagged, the weight of the confrontation finally hitting her. I put my arm around her, surprised when she leaned into the embrace. "You did good in there," I told her softly. "Really good." "Did I?" she asked, vulnerability replacing her earlier confidence. "I just broke my mother's heart." "No," Michael said firmly, opening the car door for her. "You protected your own. There's a difference." Later that night, after setting up the guest room for Jasmine and making sure she had everything she needed, I found Michael, sitting on our back porch, staring up at the stars. I settled into the chair beside him, pulling my cardigan tighter against the October chill. "Are we doing the right thing?" I asked softly. Michael was quiet for a long moment. "When I was 17, he finally said, I got accepted to Cornell. Full ride, just like Jasmine. This was news to me." "You never told me that," he shrugged. "Mom tore up the acceptance letter. Said she needed me close to home, that only selfish children abandoned their mothers." His voice held no bitterness, just a quiet acknowledgement of an old wound. "I've always wondered who I might have become if I'd gone." I reached for his hand in the darkness. "You became a wonderful teacher. A good man. Eventually," he agreed. "But only after breaking free of the patterns I was raised with." He turned to me, his expression earnest in the faint porch light. "That's what we're giving Jasmine. A chance to break free while she's still young enough for it to shape her future, not just heal her past." As we sat in companionable silence, I realized how far we had come, not just from the crisis of last year, but from the people we had been for 13 years of marriage. We had both been trapped in patterns, Michael in his mother's manipulations, me in my own need to keep peace at any cost. Breaking those patterns had been painful, messy, and at times devastating. But sitting there under the October stars, with Jasmine sleeping safely in our guest room and the future stretching open before us, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Hope. Pure, uncomplicated hope. On a mild day in early May, I stood in our backyard, surveying the small gathering with a sense of quiet satisfaction. Jasmine's high school graduation party wasn't elaborate. Just a few tables decorated with blue and silver streamers, a homemade cake, and a banner Michael had painted himself. "Congratulations, UCLA freshman." After completing her first semester with straight A's, Jasmine had returned to Rosefield for the summer, dividing her time between a research internship at the local community college and our spare bedroom. She moved through the yard now with easy confidence, chatting with her former teachers and the few friends who had supported her decision to leave early for college. "She looks happy," Mrs. Deacon observed, settling into the chair beside me. At 73, she still maintained her daily walking routine and bridge club, though she'd reluctantly accepted our help with lawn maintenance this past year. "She is happy," I agreed, for maybe the first time in her life. "You and Michael did that," she said, patting my hand. "You gave her a safe harbor." I watched as Michael helped Jasmine's friend Emma set up a volleyball net, his laughter carrying across the yard. "We're just giving her what we wished someone had given us, permission to choose her own path." The party was small but joyful. Noticeably absent were Nancy and Tiffany, though not for lack of invitation. Jasmine, in an act of maturity that humbled me, had sent them both graduation announcements and explicit invitations to the celebration. Nancy had responded with a terse note claiming a scheduling conflict. Tiffany hadn't responded at all. "Their loss," Jasmine had said with a shrug when the day arrived without them. But I'd caught her checking the driveway periodically, a flicker of hope in her eyes that made my heart ache. As twilight approached and guests began to depart, I noticed a car pull up at the curb, a sleek silver sedan I didn't recognize. The driver's door opened and Tiffany emerged, looking uncharacteristically hesitant. Across the yard, Jasmine froze, her conversation with Lisa trailing off mid-sentence. Michael stepped protectively closer to his niece, his posture tense. I moved toward the fence, meeting Tiffany at the gate. Up close, she looked both better and worse than when I'd last seen her. Better dressed, her hair and makeup impeccable again, but with new lines around her eyes and a tightness to her mouth that spoke of hardship. "I wasn't sure I'd be welcome," she said, her voice lacking its usual sharp edge. "Jasmine invited you?" I replied simply. "It's her day." Tiffany nodded, her gaze moving past me to where her daughter stood watching. "She looks good. Happy. She is. I brought her something." Tiffany held up a small wrapped package. "Can I?" I stepped aside, allowing her into the yard. The remaining guests fell silent, watching with undisguised curiosity as Tiffany approached her daughter. Jasmine remained still, her expression guarded but not hostile. Congratulations, Tiffany said, holding out the package. I'm sorry I'm late. Jasmine accepted the gift cautiously. Thank you for coming. An awkward silence fell between them, two people connected by blood but separated by choices. Finally, Tiffany spoke again, her voice so low I had to strain to hear. I'm proud of you, she said, for being braver than I ever was. Something in Jasmine's face softened. Not forgiveness exactly, but perhaps the beginning of understanding. She opened the package carefully, revealing a delicate silver bracelet. It was your grandmother's, your father's mother, Tiffany explained. She always said it should go to you when you graduated. Jasmine slipped it onto her wrist, visibly moved. I don't remember her. She was a good woman, Tiffany said. Strong, independent, like you. The interaction wasn't dramatic or emotional. No tearful reconciliation, no grand promises. Just a small moment of connection, tentative and fragile. Tiffany stayed for exactly 27 minutes by my count, accepting a piece of cake and making stiff small talk with Michael before excusing herself with a business appointment. As she left, she paused beside me at the gate. Thank you, she said, not quite meeting my eyes. For what? For not turning her against me completely. Her gaze finally lifted to mine. You could have. After everything, you would have been justified. That's not who I am, I replied, and it's not who Jasmine needs me to be. A flicker of something like respect crossed Tiffany's face. No, she agreed. I suppose it isn't. After she departed, the party resumed its natural rhythm. If Jasmine was disappointed by the brevity of her mother's visit, she didn't show it, returning to her friends with renewed energy. Later, as we cleaned up the backyard together, she finally mentioned it. Mom's seeing someone, she said casually, folding a tablecloth. Some investment guy from Cincinnati. That's where she was going tonight. Is that good? I asked, unsure how to respond. Jasmine considered this. I think so. He makes her laugh, and he pays for his own stuff, which is new for her. She smiled wryly. Baby steps, right? Baby steps, I agreed, marveling at her wisdom. Summer flowed around us like a gentle stream. Jasmine's presence in our home brought unexpected joy. Game nights at the kitchen table, passionate discussions about books and politics, her youthful energy a counterbalance to our middle-aged routines. She was blossoming before our eyes, shedding the defensive layers she'd developed under Tiffany's influence and revealing the thoughtful, compassionate young woman beneath. In July, an unexpected letter arrived from Nancy's attorney. I recognized the firm's letterhead immediately and opened it with trepidation, half expecting another legal challenge. Instead, I found a cashier's check for $35,000 and a brief note. This completes the restitution payments as ordered by the court. No further communication is necessary. No apology. No acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Just a financial transaction completed. A legal obligation fulfilled. It was so characteristic of Nancy that I almost laughed. What will we do with it? Michael asked that evening as we sat on the back porch, the check between us on the small table like a visitor. Neither of us particularly wanted. I've been thinking about that, I replied. What if we created a scholarship for students at Rosefield High who want to attend college despite family pressure not to? Michael's face lit up. The Lillian Warren Memorial Scholarship. Exactly. We established the fund through the local community foundation, setting aside $30,000 as principal and using the remaining $5,000 for the first year's award. When the foundation announced the scholarship in the local paper, Mrs. Deacon clipped the article and mailed it to Nancy without comment, a small act of poetic justice that made me smile when she confessed it. Do you think she'll be angry? I asked. I think she'll be livid, Mrs. Deacon replied with satisfaction. Having her sister's name attached to something that directly counters everything Nancy stands for? It's perfect. As August approached, bringing with it preparations for Jasmine's return to California and my own return to the classroom, Michael and I began discussing a topic we'd circled for months, our anniversary. Our 15th was coming in September, a milestone that felt significant given everything we'd weathered. The previous year, our 14th, had passed with minimal acknowledgement. We'd been too raw, too focused on rebuilding trust to celebrate. I want to do something special this year, Michael said one night as we walked around the neighborhood, another new habit we'd developed during our reconciliation. Something that honors where we've been and where we're going. Like what? I asked, curious. What if we renewed our vows? Not a big ceremony, Just us, maybe Jasmine and Mrs. Deacon as witnesses. Something simple but meaningful. The idea resonated unexpectedly. Our original wedding had been shaped by Nancy's preferences, the venue she chose, the guests she invited, the traditions she insisted upon. A vow renewal would be entirely ours. Under the oak tree in the backyard, I suggested. Just before sunset. Michael's smile was answer enough. On our anniversary, the backyard was transformed. Michael had strung fairy lights through the branches of the oak tree, their soft glow complementing the golden light of early evening. Mrs. Deacon sat in a comfortable chair, resplendent in a lilac dress she'd worn to her own daughter's wedding decades ago. Jasmine, home for the weekend, had set up a small speaker system playing the same song Michael and I had first danced to 15 years earlier. No elaborate decorations, no formal attire, no audience beyond the two people who had stood by us most faithfully. It was perfect. As Michael and I faced each other beneath the oak, hand in hand, I felt a profound sense of rightness wash over me. This was what marriage should be. Not a performance. For others, not a battleground for power, but a quiet commitment between two people choosing each other day after day. 15 years ago, Michael began, his voice steady and sure. I made promises to you that I didn't fully understand. I pledged to honor and cherish you, but I didn't know then how challenging that would be. Not because you were difficult to love, but because I hadn't learned how to love properly. He squeezed my hands gently. Today, I make those promises again, with clearer eyes and a stronger heart. I promise to see you, truly see you, and to stand beside you, not behind my family or my fears. I promise to build our life according to our values, not anyone else's expectations. Tears blurred my vision as I offered my own renewed vows. 15 years ago, I promised to love you for better or worse, but I think I always expected mostly better. Now I know that sometimes the worst can lead to something better than we ever imagined, if we're brave enough to face it together. I touched the silver locket at my throat. Aunt Lillian's gift, which I'd worn every day since receiving it. I promised to value myself enough to speak my truth, and to value you enough to hear yours. I promise to build a home with you that's defined by honesty, not harmony at any cost. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across our small gathering, Michael and I sealed our renewed commitment with a kiss that felt both familiar and entirely new. Later that evening, after Mrs. Deacon had been escorted home and Jasmine had tactfully disappeared to a friend's house, Michael and I sat on the back porch, watching stars appear one by one in the darkening sky. Do you ever regret it? Michael asked softly. Standing up to them? It cost us so much. I considered the question carefully. No, I finally answered. It cost us what wasn't real to begin with. False peace, conditional acceptance, relationships built on manipulation rather than love. I turned to face him, taking in the features I had loved for 15 years. The crinkles at the corners of his eyes, deeper now. The gentle curve of his mouth. The streak of gray at his temples that hadn't been there before all this began. What we gained was worth the cost, I continued. Truth, self-respect, a marriage that's genuine, not just a performance for your mother's approval. Michael nodded, his gaze thoughtful. I keep thinking about Aunt Lillian's letter, about leaving the inheritance to the only two people in the family who still believe in hard work and decency. What about it? I think I finally understand what she meant. The real inheritance wasn't the money. It was the courage to live honestly, something Mom and Tiffany never valued. I smiled, recognizing the truth in his words. Maybe that's what we're passing on to Jasmine now, the real family legacy. Michael's hand found mine in the gathering darkness. I'm sorry it took me so long to understand. You got there, I said simply. That's what matters. As we sat in companionable silence, I reflected on the journey of the past 2 years, from that shattered wedding photo on our living room floor to this moment of hard-won peace. We had lost much, illusions, certainties, the comfortable numbness of compromise, but we had gained something far more precious, a marriage built on truth rather than accommodation, mutual respect rather than obligation. Some inheritances can't be measured in dollars. Some are measured in courage, in wisdom, in the steadfast belief in one's own worth. Those are the ones that truly matter, the legacy that can't be spent or stolen, only lived and shared. As the stars multiplied overhead, I felt Aunt Lillian's presence in the weight of the locket against my skin and the strength in my own voice. I had finally learned what she had always known, that standing in your truth, even when it costs you dearly, is the only path to genuine peace. And that is an inheritance beyond price.